November 23, 1942, 24,000 feet above the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire, France. Second Lieutenant Howard Goodner peered through the frameless plexiglass nose of his B-17F Flying Fortress, watching enemy fighters assemble in the distance. The bombardier's single .30 caliber machine gun sat mounted in its socket beside him, its thin barrel pointed forward into empty sky. Through his interphone, the pilot's voice crackled with routine precision. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The formation was tight, the bomb run was minutes away. Then the fighters turned toward them, and everything Goodner had been told about the Flying Fortress's invulnerability proved catastrophically wrong. The Focke-Wulf 190s came straight at the nose, not from the sides where the waist gunners waited, not from below where the ball turret could traverse, not from behind where the tail gunner had clear fields of fire. Directly from 12 o'clock high, closing at a combined speed, exceeding 500 miles per hour. Goodner fired his single light machine gun, watching his tracers disappear into the void between his aircraft and the approaching fighters. The .30 caliber weapon, designed for training purposes, offered no more deterrent than a flashlight against the sun. In the 4 seconds before the German fighters screamed past, their 20mm cannons tore through the nose section. The plexiglass shattered. The navigator beside Goodner collapsed. 2 bombers from the formation spun toward Earth, their cockpits destroyed, their pilots dead before they could reach for the controls. Captain Egon Meyer pulled his Fevelty 190 into a climbing left turn, watching the American bomber formation continue toward its target. Behind him, his wingmen executed the same maneuver. They had just validated a theory Meyer had been developing for weeks. The mighty B-17 Flying Fortress, armed with up to 11 machine guns and celebrated in American propaganda as invincible, had a blind spot. The entire front of the aircraft was defended by a single handheld weapon that couldn't effectively engage a high-speed frontal attack. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By late 1942, the United States Army Air Forces had committed to a doctrine that would define the air war over Europe: daylight precision bombing. The theory was elegant in its simplicity. Heavy bombers flying in tight formation at high altitude could defend themselves through concentrated firepower while delivering bombs accurately on specific industrial targets. Fighter escort wouldn't be necessary. The bombers themselves, bristling with .50 caliber machine guns, would create an impenetrable defensive sphere of lead. Any enemy fighter attempting to attack the formation would be destroyed by overlapping fields of fire. The B-17 Flying Fortress embodied this philosophy. Its very name projected strength. Boeing had designed the aircraft in 1935 as a coastal defense weapon, and a Seattle journalist, observing the prototype bristling with gun positions, had coined the name Flying Fortress. The Army Air Corps adopted the name enthusiastically. It captured exactly the image they wanted to project: an airborne castle, immune to conventional attack, capable of defending itself while striking enemy heartlands. The B-17E, which entered service in 1941, carried 9 machine guns, 2 in a powered dorsal turret behind the cockpit, 2 in a powered ventral ball turret beneath the fuselage, 2 in the tail position. Single, flexible guns in each waist position and in the radio compartment. The nose was defended by a single .30 caliber weapon, but Air Corps planners didn't consider this a vulnerability. Enemy fighters would attack from the rear, where turrets could bring multiple guns to bear. Frontal attacks were considered too dangerous for the attacking pilot, requiring extraordinary skill at closure rates that left almost no time to aim and fire. The B-17F, which began rolling off production lines in May 1942, incorporated improvements based on early combat experience. The nose received a larger, nearly frameless plexiglass enclosure that gave the bombardier better visibility. Some aircraft were retrofitted with .50 caliber cheek guns, single handheld weapons mounted on either side of the nose. But these weren't standard equipment on early production blocks. The bombardier still relied primarily on his .30 caliber weapon for forward defense. Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed Vega produced 3,405 B-17Fs. They became the primary heavy bomber for the 8th Air Force's campaign against Nazi Germany throughout 1943. The combat box formation evolved as the tactical expression of self-defending bomber doctrine. Colonel Curtis LeMay of the 305th Bomb Group pioneered the 18-aircraft squadron box. 3 B-17s flew in a lead element, 3 more flew high and to the right, 3 flew low and to the left. A fourth element of 3 aircraft filled the most exposed position. 3 such squadron boxes, staggered vertically, formed a group. 3 groups in trail formed a combat wing. Every bomber could bring its guns to bear on any attacking fighter. The formation moved through the sky like a floating fortress, each aircraft protecting the others through interlocking fields of fire. German fighter pilots called attacking these formations like trying to make love to a porcupine that is on fire. The ball turrets could rotate 360 degrees and elevate to track targets in any direction, except directly forward or aft. The top turrets could traverse rapidly, their paired .50 caliber guns sweeping the upper hemisphere. The waist gunners, though exposed to freezing temperatures and working against the slipstream, could engage targets on either beam. The tail gunner covered the entire rear quarter. .50 caliber rounds, fired at 750 rounds per minute, created a curtain of metal through which German fighters had to fly. But the doctrine contained a fatal assumption. It presumed that enemy fighters would attack from positions where the bomber's defensive firepower was strongest. Throughout 1942, that assumption held. German fighter pilots, most of them veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, attacked B-17 formations from the rear quarter or from the beam. They accepted losses from defensive fire as the cost of engaging the bombers. Some pilots specialized in destroying the lead aircraft, knowing that disrupting the formation's leadership would scatter the group and make individual bombers vulnerable. Hauptmann Egon Meyer had joined the Luftwaffe in 1937. By November 1942, he had 52 victories, most against Royal Air Force Spitfires over France. As Gruppencommander of the 3rd Group of Jagdgeschwader II, Richthofen, he commanded a unit tasked with intercepting American bomber raids. Unlike many Luftwaffe pilots, Meyer possessed an analytical mind that complemented his flying skills. He studied combat reports. He visited crash sites of downed B-17s, examining their structure and armament. He interviewed pilots who had attacked the formations, learning what worked and what failed. Meyer noticed something the American doctrine had overlooked. The B-17's defensive armament concentrated on protecting the sides, top, bottom, and rear. The nose was virtually undefended. A single handheld weapon, often just a .30 caliber gun, represented the only obstacle to a frontal attack. The upper turret couldn't depress enough to engage targets directly ahead. The ball turret sat too far back. The cheek guns, on aircraft that had them, offered limited fields of fire. An attacking fighter approaching from 12 o'clock high faced minimal defensive fire during the critical engagement window. The tactical challenge was formidable. A frontal attack required exceptional skill. The German fighter and the American bomber closed at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. The attacking pilot had perhaps 4 seconds to align his aircraft, aim his weapons, fire, and break away before collision. At those closure rates, standard deflection shooting techniques wouldn't work. The pilot had to aim ahead of the target, leading it by precisely the right amount to account for the bomber's forward motion. Miss the lead calculation by even a small margin, and the shells would stream harmlessly past, overcorrect, and the attacker might collide with his target. But if executed correctly, a frontal attack offered decisive advantages. The bomber's pilots sat behind relatively thin armor plating, designed primarily to protect against fire from the rear. A burst of 20mm cannon shells entering through the nose could kill both pilots, destroying the aircraft instantly. The bombardier and navigator, sitting in the plexiglass nose section with no armor protection, were completely exposed. Even if the pilots survived, killing the bombardier meant the aircraft couldn't fulfill its mission. Engine hits were more effective from the front, where cooling systems and oil lines were concentrated. A fighter that successfully pressed a frontal attack could disable a bomber before the defensive gunners could bring sustained fire to bear. Together with Oberleutnant Georg Peter Eder, Meyer developed the tactical framework. 3 fighters would attack in a Kette formation, a shallow V-shape. They would approach from ahead and slightly to the left, diving through the formation at high speed. Each pilot would open fire at about 400 yards, aiming in front of the lead bomber's nose. The stream of cannon shells and machine gun bullets would converge on the cockpit area. After firing, each pilot would pull up sharply to the left or right, using the vertical escape to avoid both collision and the bomber's defensive fire. The first organized test of the tactic came on November 23, 1942. 91 B-17s from the 8th Air Force attacked the U-boat construction facilities at Saint-Nazaire. Meyer led elements of JG-2 into position ahead of the bomber stream. His Fokker-Wulf 190 pilots formed into Ketten and turned toward the approaching Americans. The bombers, flying in their standard combat boxes, presented what appeared to be formidable defensive firepower. But Meyer and his pilots ignored the traditional attack angles. They came straight at the nose. The results validated every calculation. Meyer personally shot down 2 B-17s and 1 B-24 Liberator. His pilots claimed additional bombers. More importantly, the defensive fire they encountered proved negligible. The bombardiers firing .30 caliber guns couldn't effectively engage fighters at closure rates exceeding 500 miles per hour. The few bombers equipped with cheek guns faced the same problem. The weapons were handheld, requiring the gunner to track a target moving across his field of view at impossible speeds while compensating for his own aircraft's motion. Even when gunners managed to fire, their bullets rarely found targets. The attacking fighters were exposed to effective defensive fire for perhaps 2 seconds as they closed and broke away. 8th Air Force Headquarters noted the tactical shift immediately. After-action reports from the Saint-Nazaire mission documented the new German approach. Mission analysts wrote, "A change of enemy fighter tactics was observed in this operation, nearly all attacks being farted, frontal and apparently aimed at the right side of the nose." One historian later recorded that from that moment, the B-17 was obsolete as a self-defending bomber. German General Major Adolf Galland, commander of fighter forces, recognized the significance. He circulated new tactical regulations to all Luftwaffe fighter units on the Western Front. The document listed 5 object lessons from recent combat. The first stated explicitly, "The attack from the rear against a 4-engined bomber formation promises little success and almost always brings losses." Frontal attacks became doctrine. Units across the Luftwaffe began training pilots in the technique Meyer had demonstrated. American bomber crews experienced the shift immediately. Missions in late 1942 and early 1943 saw increasing numbers of frontal attacks. Pilots reported fighters approaching head-on in formations of 3 to 12 aircraft. The attacks were coordinated and precise. German fighters would position themselves ahead of the bomber stream, often paralleling the formation just outside effective gun range, then turn inward for the attack. Multiple Ketten would strike in sequence, giving each element clear fields of fire while maintaining continuous pressure on the formation. The psychological impact devastated crews. Bombardiers and navigators, sitting in their plexiglass greenhouse nose sections, watched fighters approach from ahead with no effective means of defense. The .30 caliber guns felt inadequate to the point of absurdity. Some crews described trying to return fire as like throwing stones at a train. The bombers' much celebrated defensive firepower, so effective against beam and tail attacks, couldn't protect the front of the aircraft. Casualty rates among lead crews soared. German pilots recognized that destroying the lead aircraft disrupted the entire formation. They concentrated frontal attacks on the lead squadron, knowing that killing those bombardiers would prevent accurate bomb delivery even if the rest of the formation survived. Nose section hits accounted for an increasing percentage of bomber losses. Medical officers treating survivors reported injuries consistent with frontal attacks, facial wounds from plexiglass fragments, wounds to the upper body, and specific patterns of trauma indicating the crew had been hit from ahead. The first major American raid on Germany itself demonstrated the full scope of the problem. On January 27, 1943, 58 B-17s and B-24s attacked the port of Wilhelmshaven. German fighters intercepted the formation using frontal attack tactics exclusively. The bombers' defensive fire, so impressive in pre-war demonstrations, proved far less effective under actual combat conditions. Gunners who had trained to engage targets attacking from predictable angles found themselves unable to track fighters closing head-on at combined speeds of over 500 miles per hour. The doctrine that promised self-defending bomber formations had encountered a tactical reality it couldn't overcome. The B-17 Flying Fortress, designed to fight its way to target without fighter escort, couldn't effectively defend its nose. German fighter pilots had identified the vulnerability and developed a tactic to exploit it. Every bomber mission deeper into German territory would face the same threat. The defensive sphere of fire existed only in theory. In practice, a determined frontal attack could penetrate it with relative impunity. In bomb groups across England, crews requested modifications to their aircraft. Some field modifications added extra cheek guns. Others moved existing guns to better positions. Armourers experimented with twin-gun mounts in the nose. Nothing solved the fundamental problem. Handheld weapons couldn't provide effective defense against high-speed frontal attacks. The guns couldn't traverse fast enough. The gunners couldn't track targets accurately at extreme closure rates. Even when fire connected, single .50 caliber guns lacked the hitting power to reliably destroy or disable an attacking fighter before it completed its pass. The mathematics of survival turned against American crews. 8th Air Force intelligence analysts calculated that a bomber crew's odds of completing the required 25-mission tour stood at less than 1 in 4. Losses on individual missions sometimes exceeded 20%. The Stuttgart raid on September 6, 1943, cost 45 B-17s. The Schweinfurt mission on October 14, 1943, destroyed 60 B-17s outright, with 17 more damaged beyond repair. Deep raids into Germany were suspended. The self-defending bomber concept had failed. Medical officers reported alarming increases in combat fatigue. Men displayed symptoms the flight surgeons called flak happy, or the Fokker-Wulff jitters. Insomnia, tremors, weight loss, inability to concentrate. Some crews became so exhausted that they fell asleep between fighter attacks. Others developed elaborate superstitions, convinced that specific behaviors would protect them. The psychological strain came not just from danger, but from helplessness. Gunners in the tail, waist, and ball turret could fight back effectively. Bombardiers and navigators in the nose could only watch fighters approach and hope their inadequate weapons might somehow deflect the attack. The crisis demanded a solution. American aircraft production could replace lost bombers. Training programs could produce new crews. But no industrial capacity could sustain loss rates approaching 20% per mission. The strategic bombing campaign, central to American war plans, hung in balance. Without effective frontal defense, B-17 formations couldn't survive sustained operations over Germany. The doctrine required revision, or the campaign required abandonment. The solution emerged not from strategic planning committees, but from desperation in the field. Engineering officers at modification centres across England watched crews jury-rig additional weapons into nose compartments. Some bombardiers mounted extra .50 caliber guns on improvised brackets. Others repositioned cheek guns to provide better forward coverage. The modifications helped marginally, but handheld weapons still couldn't provide the sustained, accurate fire necessary to deter frontal attacks. What the B-17 needed wasn't more flexible guns. It needed a powered turret in the nose. The concept wasn't new. As early as 1942, the Army Air Forces had experimented with various armament configurations for heavy bombers. The challenge lay in engineering a turret that could fit into the B-17's nose without compromising the bombardier's workspace or obstructing his visibility during the bomb run. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The nose compartment was already cramped, filled with the Norden bomb site, navigation equipment, and the bombardier's station. Adding a turret meant solving multiple problems simultaneously: structural reinforcement to handle the turret's weight and recoil, electrical systems to power the turret's traverse and elevation mechanisms, and control systems that allowed the bombardier to operate both the turret and his primary bombing equipment. The YB-40 program provided the testbed. In September 1942, the Army Air Forces approved a concept for a heavily armed escort version of the B-17F. The YB-40 would carry no bombs. Instead, its bomb bay would hold ammunition for an arsenal of defensive weapons. A second dorsal turret would be installed in the radio compartment. The waist positions would mount twin guns instead of single weapons. Most importantly, the nose would receive a remotely operated powered turret mounting 2.50 caliber machine guns. Lockheed's Vega plant, in Burbank, California, received the contract to convert the second production B-17F into the YB-40 prototype. Engineers selected a Bendix-designed turret originally developed for the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber. The Bendix turret was remotely operated, meaning the gunner didn't sit inside the turret itself. Instead, he controlled it from a nearby position using a small control yoke connected to the turret's traverse and elevation motors. For the YB-40 installation, the turret was mounted under the nose, directly beneath the bombardier's station. The bombardier would operate the chin turret using controls mounted at his position, allowing him to engage targets ahead while maintaining access to his bombing equipment. The Bendix chin turret represented sophisticated engineering for its time. 2.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns were mounted side by side in a rotating housing. Electric motors powered by the aircraft's electrical system traversed the 12 turret horizontally and elevated it vertically. The bombardier aimed using a reflector sight that showed where the guns were pointed. He controlled traverse and elevation with a small control yoke, similar to an aircraft control stick but much smaller. Pressing the firing button sent electrical signals to fire both guns simultaneously. Each gun had 400 rounds of ammunition, fed from boxes mounted in the nose compartment. The turret's field of fire proved impressive. It could traverse through approximately 170 degrees of azimuth, covering the entire forward hemisphere except for areas blocked by the aircraft's structure. Elevation ranged from roughly 20 degrees below horizontal to 45 degrees above, allowing the bombardier to engage targets approaching from various angles. The guns could be fired individually or together, giving the operator flexibility in conserving ammunition or delivering maximum firepower. Between May and August 1943, 13 YB-40s deployed to England with the 8th Air Force's 92nd Bomb Group at Alconbury. The concept behind the YB-40 was straightforward. These heavily armed escorts would fly in formation with standard B-17Fs, using their superior firepower to drive off attacking fighters. The additional guns, particularly the chin turret, would provide the frontal defense that standard bombers lacked. Combat testing revealed the YB-40's fundamental flaw almost immediately. The aircraft, weighing over 10,000 pounds more than a standard B-17F due to additional guns and ammunition, struggled to maintain formation speed after the standard bombers dropped their bomb loads. The regular B-17s, suddenly thousands of pounds lighter, could fly faster and climb more efficiently. The YB-40s, still carrying their full ammunition load, fell behind. German fighters simply avoided the YB-40s and attacked the now vulnerable standard bombers. But the combat missions validated one critical component. The Bendix chin turret worked exactly as designed. Bombardiers operating the turret reported that it provided effective forward defense. The powered traverse allowed them to track approaching fighters far more accurately than with handheld weapons. The concentrated fire from 2.50 caliber guns, properly aimed, could force attacking fighters to break off or inflict serious damage on aircraft that pressed their attacks. Colonel William Reed, commander of the 92nd Bomb Group, analyzed combat reports and concluded that the chin turret alone accounted for the majority of the YB-40's defensive improvement over standard B-17Fs. His estimate suggested the chin turret increased frontal defensive effectiveness by approximately 10%. The YB-40 program was cancelled in July 1943. the escort concept had failed, but the Bendix chin turret had proven its value. In April 1943, even before the combat trials concluded, the Army Air Forces directed that surplus Bendix turrets from cancelled B-25 production be installed on B-17Fs as an interim measure. More importantly, Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed received orders to incorporate the Bendix chin turret as standard equipment on all future B-17 production. Douglas Aircraft's Long Beach plant implemented the modification first. The final 86 aircraft of their B-17F production run, designated B-17F-75DL and later blocks, received factory-installed chin turrets. These aircraft required structural reinforcement of the nose section to handle the turret's weight and recoil forces. The lower nose structure gained additional formers and stringers. The plexiglass panels were redesigned to accommodate the turret's protrusion. Electrical systems were upgraded to provide power for the turret motors. Boeing designated the chin turret-equipped version as the B-17G. The first production B-17G rolled off Boeing's Seattle assembly line in August 1943. By the time production ended in July 1945, Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed had built 8,680 B-17Gs, making it the most produced variant of the Flying Fortress. The B-17G incorporated numerous improvements beyond the chin turret. The waist gun positions were staggered, with the port gun mounted forward and the starboard gun mounted aft, giving the waist gunners more room to move without interfering with each other. The tail gun position received the improved Cheyenne turret with a larger field of fire and better sighting equipment. Minneapolis Honeywell electric turbo supercharger regulators allowed the pilot to control manifold pressure for all four engines with a single control, simplifying high-altitude operations. But the Bendix chin turret was the most visible, and tactically, significant change. It transformed the B-17 from a bomber vulnerable to frontal attack into an aircraft that could defend itself from all angles. The psychological impact on both American and German aircrews proved as important as the tactical improvement. For American bombardiers, the chin turret restored a sense of control they had lost. Instead of watching fighters approach with only an inadequate handheld weapon, they now operated a powered turret capable of delivering sustained, accurate fire. The turret's controls were intuitive. The bombardier placed his hands on the small control yoke mounted at his station. Moving the yoke left or right traversed the turret. Pushing forward or pulling back elevated or depressed the guns. A trigger on the yoke fired both weapons. The reflector sight showed where the guns aimed, with a reticle that moved as the turret traversed and elevated. Operating the turret required skill and practice. The bombardier had to judge the closure, rate of approaching fighters, and lead his targets appropriately. At combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, proper deflection shooting demanded quick calculations and smooth control inputs. But unlike handheld weapons, the powered turret could track targets smoothly through the entire engagement. The bombardier could begin firing at 800 to 1,000 yards, walk his fire onto the target as range decreased, and continue engaging as the fighter passed. The 2.50 caliber guns, firing 750 rounds per minute each, created a stream of bullets that German pilots learned to respect. German fighter pilots noticed the change immediately. Oberst Hannes Trautloft, commander of Jagdgeschwader 54, reported to his pilots in late 1943 that the Americans had modified their bombers with nose turrets. He instructed his pilots to exercise caution when executing frontal attacks. The easy kills that had been available against B-17Fs were gone. The new turrets could engage effectively at ranges where previously the bombers had been defenseless. Hauptmann Walter Oso, an experienced bomber-destroyer with over 100 victories, described the tactical adjustment required. Frontal attacks remained viable, he reported, but required better coordination. Single fighters or small formations could no longer approach directly from 12 o'clock high and expect to penetrate without taking hits. Instead, fighters needed to attack in larger formations, using saturation tactics to overwhelm the turret's defensive capability. Alternatively, attacks from slightly off-axis angles, where the turret's field of fire was partially obstructed by the aircraft's structure, offered better survival odds. The statistics told the story. Analysis of bomber losses before and after the B-17G's introduction showed a measurable decline in aircraft lost to frontal attacks, while German fighters continued to inflict heavy casualties. The nature of those casualties changed. Fewer bombers were destroyed by single catastrophic hits to the cockpit or nose section. More aircraft sustained damage from multiple attack passes, suggesting that German pilots were breaking off attacks earlier rather than pressing through concentrated defensive fire. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Bendix chin turret had limitations. Its powered traverse motors, while faster than hand-operated mounts, still couldn't track targets instantaneously. A skilled German pilot approaching at high speed and optimal angle could minimize his exposure to turret fire to perhaps 3 or 4 seconds. The turret's ammunition capacity of 400 rounds per gun limited sustained engagement. In a mission involving multiple fighter attacks, bombardiers had to conserve ammunition, firing controlled bursts rather than continuous streams. The turret itself created problems. When fired at maximum elevation, the muzzle blast from the guns could crack the plexiglass nose panels. Engineers solved this by fitting blast tubes that directed the muzzle gases away from the nose structure, but early B-17Gs experienced numerous cracked panels until the modification became standard. The turret's weight and drag reduced the aircraft's top speed by approximately 3 to 5 miles per hour and increased fuel consumption slightly. The additional electrical load from the turret motors occasionally overwhelmed the aircraft's electrical system, particularly when multiple turrets operated simultaneously during intense combat. More seriously, the B-17G suffered from design issues unrelated to the chin turret. The ability to feather propeller blades, critical for engine-out emergencies, was lost when engineers removed a standpipe that held oil for the feathering system in an effort to reduce weight. This became a major cause of bomber losses in winter 1943, when engine failures left pilots unable to feather the failed engine's propeller. The resulting drag and vibration could tear the engine from its mount. The problem wasn't corrected until September 1944, when modified aircraft with restored feathering capability began reaching operational units. The B-17G also lacked an engine fire extinguisher system. Designers had concluded that the systems used on earlier variants were ineffective and deleted them to save weight. This decision proved disastrous in combat. Engine fires, common results of fighter attacks or anti-aircraft hits, could not be extinguished. Crews had to either shut down the affected engine and hope the fire burned itself out, or abandon the aircraft. Many bombers that might have survived with fire suppression systems were lost. Despite these problems, the B-17G, with its Bendix chin turret, represented a dramatic improvement over previous variants. The 8th Air Force received 6,500 B-17Gs between late 1943 and the war's end. By March 1945, the 8th could dispatch 2,370 B-17Gs on a single mission, creating bomber streams that stretched for miles across German skies. The chin turret's effectiveness increased as bombardiers gained experience. Early missions saw inexperienced operators burning through ammunition too quickly or failing to properly lead their targets. Training programs improved. Gunnery instructors developed specific techniques for engaging fighters at high closure rates. Bombardiers learned to recognize the approach patterns German fighters used and to position their fire accordingly. The best bombardiers could fire short bursts, just enough to force an attacker to break off, conserving ammunition for subsequent attacks. The turret's presence changed German tactical calculations. While frontal attacks remained part of Luftwaffe doctrine, they were no longer the preferred method. By mid-1944, German fighter units increasingly attacked from the rear and sides, where the B-17's defensive fire, though heavy, offered the attacking pilot more options for breaking away from concentrated fire. The chin turret had closed the vulnerability it was designed to address. The arrival of long-range escort fighters in early 1944 fundamentally altered the air war over Europe. North American P-51 Mustangs, equipped with external fuel tanks, could accompany bomber formations all the way to Berlin and back. The self-defending bomber doctrine that had driven B-17 design finally gave way to reality. Bombers needed fighter protection, but the Bendix chin turret remained valuable even after Mustangs arrived overhead. German fighter pilots, pressed by American escorts, developed new tactics. Sturm units, heavily armed and armored, Focke-Wulf 190s, attempted to break through escort screens using mass formations. These aircraft, designed specifically for bomber destruction, pressed attacks with determination that bordered on fanaticism. Some pilots deliberately rammed bombers after exhausting their ammunition. Against these desperate tactics, every defensive weapon mattered. The chin turret provided critical additional firepower during the seconds when German fighters penetrated the escort screen and reached the bomber formations. Technical Sergeant James Rasmussen, a bombardier with the 306th Bomb Group, described his experience operating the chin turret during a mission to Brunswick in January 1944. Two Fevu 190s broke through the fighter escort and attacked from 12 o'clock high. Rasmussen engaged at 900 yards, walking his tracers toward the lead fighter. The German pilot held his course, firing his cannons. At 400 yards, Rasmussen saw strikes on the fighter's wing route. The Fevu 190 rolled inverted and dropped away, trailing smoke. The second fighter broke off his attack. Rasmussen's aircraft sustained minor damage, but the nose turret had prevented what might have been a catastrophic hit. Not all encounters ended favorably. The chin turret's field of fire had limits. German pilots learned to attack from angles where the turret couldn't track effectively, or where the aircraft structure blocked the guns. Attacks from slightly below the nose, where the turret's depression was limited, proved particularly effective. Some German pilots approached from directly ahead but slightly offset, forcing the bombardier to choose between targets when multiple fighters attacked simultaneously. The turret required constant maintenance. The electrical motors that powered traverse and elevation mechanisms failed regularly under combat conditions. Vibration from sustained firing loosened connections. Hydraulic lines for the gun, charging mechanisms developed leaks. Ammunition feed systems jammed, particularly in the extreme cold at bombing altitudes, where temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Ground crews worked through British winter nights, maintaining turrets on aircraft that would fly again at dawn. By May 1944, when long-range escort became standard, the 8th Air Force's leadership made a significant decision. With fighter protection now effective, bomber defensive armament became less critical. One waist gunner position was eliminated from most aircraft. The radio room gun, rarely used in combat, was removed. Ammunition loads were reduced. These weight savings improved the aircraft's center of gravity, which had been problematic since the B-17F's introduction. Some combat wings, operating in the war's final months when German fighter opposition had nearly ceased, flew missions with waist guns, ball turrets, and even chin turrets removed. The streamlining increased airspeed by an estimated 25 miles per hour. But through most of 1944, the chin turret remained standard equipment. German fighter strength, though declining, remained dangerous. On missions where fighter opposition was expected, every defensive weapon stayed installed and manned. The turret's value wasn't measured solely in fighters destroyed. Its deterrent effect, forcing German pilots to approach more cautiously or break off attacks earlier, saved bombers that never recorded the turret's contribution in their after-action reports. The cost of the bomber offensive remained staggering despite improved defensive armament. The 8th Air Force received 6,500 B-17Gs. By war's end, 1,301 had been shot down or reported missing in action. Thousands more sustained battle damage, requiring extensive repairs. The survival rate improved compared to early 1943, but bomber crews still faced brutal odds. Completing a tour of 25 missions, later increased to 35, remained a statistical improbability for much of the war. The Bendix chin turret represented one element in a complex system that eventually achieved air superiority over Germany. The turret addressed a specific tactical problem, the vulnerability to frontal attacks. Combined with improved fighter escort, better tactics, and overwhelming numerical superiority, it contributed to the strategic bombing campaign's eventual success. Historians debate whether strategic bombing achieved its intended goals of crippling German war production. But the tactical question the Chin turret addressed admits no debate. The B-17F was vulnerable to frontal attack. The B-17G, with its Bendix Chin turret, was not. Egon Meyer, the German pilot who pioneered the frontal attack tactic that exposed the B-17F's weakness, did not live to see the war's end. On March 2, 1944, while leading an attack on a bomber formation near Montmédy, France, Meyer's Focke-Wulf 190 was hit by fire from escorting P-47 Thunderbolts. He crashed without escaping his aircraft. He was 26 years old, credited with 102 victories, 26 of them heavy bombers. His tactical innovation had forced the Americans to redesign their primary heavy bomber. The Chin turret that killed so many of his fellow pilots existed because Meyer had identified a vulnerability American planners had overlooked. The story of the Bendix Chin turret reveals how tactical realities shape technology. American pre-war doctrine assumed bombers could defend themselves through concentrated firepower. German pilots, facing those bombers in actual combat, identified weaknesses the doctrine hadn't anticipated. The Americans responded with technical solutions, first improvised field modifications, then the engineered Chin turret. The Germans adapted again, developing new tactics to counter the improved defenses. This cycle of innovation and counter-innovation characterized the air war over Europe. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The men who flew B-17Gs with Chin turrets rarely romanticized their experience. They understood the turret as a tool, imperfect but necessary. It didn't make them invulnerable. It gave them a fighting chance against attacks that had previously left them helpless. Bombardiers who operated the turret in combat remembered the weight of the control yoke in their hands, the sound of the guns firing inches below their feet, the smell of cordite in the nose compartment, and the sight of tracers reaching toward fighters that wanted them dead. The B-17 Flying Fortress, despite its name, was never truly a fortress. But the Bendix Chin turret made it less vulnerable than it had been. In war, that incremental improvement meant the difference between crews completing their missions and never returning home. The turret represents a moment when tactical necessity drove technological innovation, when combat experience overrode doctrinal assumptions, and when the price of overlooking a single vulnerability was measured in aircraft lost and lives ended over the skies of occupied Europe. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.